Conservative Party is still doing everything they can to block this very important work. But I hope that parties that call themselves progressive, like the Bloc and the NDP, will work with us today and tomorrow.
It's an agenda of 4 shades of red on issue after issue. There are not 5 choices for Canadians. There are 2. Canada's Conservatives on one side and the Liberal, NDP, Green, Bloc Québécois coalition on the other.
House of Commons rose for the summer break this week, but not before party leaders set the stage for a possible election campaign, sharpening their message, pitching to voters. So does this mean that an election in the fall is actually in the cards? It's Thursday. I'm here with that issue. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. I know no one likes me to ask the question about whether there's going to be an election, so I'll find a million ways to not ask that. Chantal, I'll start with you. What you heard there from Aaron O'Toole and how he's positioning himself compared to the quote-unquote progressive parties. What did you make of that message and what he might be trying to do there in case there were to be an election?
I'm not sure what to make of it because if you add up all those people who vote for the NDP, the Greens, the Bloc Québécois, and the Liberals, and who are apparently happy about doing that based on polls, who is he talking to? Is my question, because day in and day out, including when the Conservatives won majority governments, majority of voters opted for those so-called progressive parties. So it's not like they're looking to run away from them.
Right. And if you're trying to broaden your tent, Andrew, I'm not sure you want to turn off any of those potential progressive voters either. What did you make of him and the Prime Minister's messaging this week?
Well, I mean, there's a certain amount of truth in O'Toole's message, particularly. On a lot of issues, it is the case that the Conservatives line up on one side and the other parties tend to line up on the other. If you had 40 to 45% of the vote, then you're going places with that strategy. You just solidify that 40 to 45%, and in our system of government, you can win a majority with that, which, frankly, given those divisions, is really the only alternative the Conservatives really have. But they're not at that, as Chantal was alluding. They're south of 30% in some polls right now. So, they're going back to the old playbook that the Conservatives always run, which is that the Liberals and the NDP are going to get into some kind of coalition. But right now, if you're looking at the polls, it's a fair chance the Liberals could win a majority without them. So again, I'm not sure it's the most effective message at this point.
What did you make of O'Toole or the Prime Minister, Althea?
I was a bit surprised because the words that came out of Aaron O'Toole's mouth are, there's only a choice between the Conservatives and the Liberals, is usually the words that you hear the Liberals say during the last week of an election campaign when they're worried that New Democrat voters are going to go vote for the NDP and they feel like they might lose their chance of forming government or they might lose their majority. I mean, we saw that in 2019 and they say, no, the big bad Conservatives are going to win, so you must vote for the Liberals. There's only 2 real choices. Only 2 parties can form government. So I actually heard O'Toole's speech more as a let's save the furniture. Let's try to shore up the base in Western Canada where his vote is softening. The 4 shades of red, the coalition talk, like that is not a message for, as Chantal rightly pointed, the Greens, the Bloc, the NDP, and the Liberals. Taking the Bloc out of that, most of those other parties are quite content that they would like to see their political parties work together. They like cooperation. And so that is not a scary thing. So I viewed it more as a possibly trying to send a message there to some potential New Democrat switchers, but I really feel like it's more a message about shoring up his base in Western Canada.
Gosh, it seemed early to be doing that, but okay. Chantal, go ahead.
And I'm not even sure that shoring up his base in Western Canada is that useful unless they have numbers that show that the Western-based secessionist party is gaining ground on them in significant ways. But otherwise, it is not as if the Conservatives do not have votes to spare in Western Canada. To come back to Justin Trudeau's message, which manages to get lost thanks to Aaron O'Toole, It does sound like the Prime Minister is trying to set up this narrative to call an election later this summer. Yeah. I'm not sure that he will be using it, because how would you get in the head of someone and predict what he's going to do? But for sure, the last week really sounded like we are setting up a narrative, and we are explaining away the fact that some of our major bills, promises that we made on conversion therapy, etc., are not going to get through. C10 on broadcasting, and that's because of the big bad Conservatives and the other parties not helping us. So in a way, it's kind of convenient. At the end of the day, though, where the message gets confused is that bills like the C6 and C10 on broadcasting will be adopted by the end of the year if there are no elections. So the main reason why they would not become law in 2021 would be the Prime Minister calling an election, and not obstruction in the House of Commons or the Senate.
So the other thing he seems to be talking about, Andrew, is the idea that after the pandemic, we have to have a debate about where the country goes. Would that be enough of a reason for him to try and justify a need for an early election?
Well, I thought that was what the throne speech and the budget were about. So, it's a bit like when he complained after proroguing Parliament last year. He complained that things weren't getting through Parliament. Well, who's kidding who? I think what's more salient in his calculations is in the last couple of weeks, it looks to me like Liberal support has been firming up quite a bit. You go back a month, they were ahead maybe 4 to 6% in the polls. It now looks more like 8 to 10, averaging the polls. So that would be, I think, really weighing quite heavily in his calculations. In a weird way, Conservative weakness is a bit of a problem for the Liberals. I mean, obviously, on balance, they're happy with that. But it does take away a little bit from their usual traditional election message to NDP voters, which is you have to vote Liberal.
That's right.
To keep the big bad Tories out. And I think perhaps not coincidentally, you're seeing NDP support actually looking quite firm.
Althea, last word on this topic.
I will just recall, and I feel like I say this quite often, but the opposition is being obstructionist. I mean, he was saying that back in December. That was the narrative he was setting up. And then he was also talking about how the parties didn't agree with his plans, even though some opposition parties had just supported his throne speech that Andrew outlined, had laid all this out. Yeah. And then there was a third wave. And so those talking points were put on the back burner. And now things look good again. And it looks like there could be an election because the country is on track with their vaccination. So, hey, let's dust up the old talking points and let's talk about them again. If C12 and C6 don't end up becoming law, it is entirely the fault of the Liberals. They sat on those pieces of legislation for weeks. They could have brought them up sooner. But for C6, I think they wanted to time it with pride. For C12, there were negotiations with the NDP. But this is entirely the Liberals' own making. And so I just want to stress that again, that it's not like the opposition really has been completely obstructionist on these pieces of legislation.
One quick go around, if we can, because we're a week away from Canada Day. Politicians have been faced with questions about how we mark that day this year. Let me play a little bit of what Erin O'Toole said yesterday on this.
This comfortable circle of Liberal insiders and friends of Justin Trudeau decide what it means to be Canadian and what the Canadian government should or shouldn't do. If you disagree, you're a bad person. Who is asking Canadians whether they want Canada Day to be cancelled?
There are some cities that have scaled back celebrations or canceled things completely in light of some of the discovery of these remains of Indigenous children at residential schools. How do politicians manage this kind of thing, Chantal, and what did you make of O'Toole?
Yeah, you're asking me this on June 24th, Saint-Jean-Baptiste Day, Fête Nationale here. I think that July 1st, Canada Day, is also a day to remember what Canada is about, bad and good. Yeah. So, and, to cancel celebrations, I'm a bit of an agnostic on this, living where I live, obviously, where garbage pickup and everything else, and moving day is July 1st. Yes. Yeah. But I'm not convinced that the best way to have a conversation is to cancel July 1st celebrations rather than use the day to have a conversation.
Andrew?
I think that's fair. Ultimately the question is, do you think Canada is worth celebrating? And on balance, I think it is. We have our share of sins against our name, and we're certainly dwelling on them right now, and rightly so. But we also have a number of great achievements to our thing and to our credit, and have built, I think, broadly speaking, a society that the world envies. So I think this particular year, we might want to be particularly concerned to mix it with some reflection on some of the terrible things that have been done in the past, and indeed in the recent past, and mix that with resolve to do a lot better in the future. And I think that is perhaps the appropriate balancing of things, of not simply, obviously not having just a celebration as if nothing terrible has been in the news lately, but also not simply wallowing in it and saying, you know, we're the worst country on earth, but finding ways in this to resolve, to do better.
Last word to you, Althea, quickly.
Yeah, I think on this probably we all agree. I feel like this is a fake wedge issue that the Conservative leader has created. It's totally understandable that there are some individuals and communities who feel like they do not wish to celebrate Canada Day. I think Canada Day is also a wonderful time to reflect on our history. I think one thing that we have noticed over the past few weeks is that a lot of people did not know about a shocking part of their history. And now the whole world is watching, and it's the ideal time to learn and reflect and take time to, you know, talk about what reconciliation really does mean, and learn to be more compassionate and loving towards each other, I think, when we've learned more about where we come from and what we've been through. Yeah, I don't see the need for that wedge issue, but I see why it fits into the whole cancel culture narrative that the Conservatives wanted to create.
We have seen a level of obstructionism and toxicity in the House that is of real concern. There's always a back and forth in Parliament. There's always got to be debate and holding people to account, and we welcome that and continue to. But there's also a time to work together.
That was the Prime Minister earlier this week talking about the state of this minority parliament, toxicity, obstruction in the House of Commons, as we've been mentioning, but the government has managed to pass legislation. Chantal, Andrew, and Althea back for another round of At Issue just to talk a little more about what did manage to get accomplished and whether there was, you know, a real difficulty for this minority government to get things done. I'm not sure that bears out entirely when you see what the government's managed to accomplish in its agenda. So I would be interested in hearing from all of you whether you agree with that, and then whether you think any piece of legislation that was passed is significant and helpful to them as we maybe head into a fall election. Chantal, I'll start with you.
Well, I'm guessing it's a problem only if you think that everything that you want to do should just be given a rubber stamp and moved on to the Senate.
Right.
This is a government that managed to get its budget passed without much of a crisis. And we've seen budget crises and budget amendments. That didn't happen. It was a major budget. The United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples and the bill to make Canadian law congruent with it passed. I think that's a historical event for many Canadians, and that took place with more than enough opposition support. Can we go back to medically assisted death legislation, which passed with debate? But the thing is, you have to decide if you're the government. Of course, you're a minority government. Maybe you don't like debate. But what I mostly see, including C12, which is about those that framework, that climate change framework, which is now in the Senate, what I mostly see is a minority parliament where opposition parties contribute to the discussion.
I think what the government says, Andrew, and obviously this is just their perspective, is that there was no policy debate. It was all partisan. I think that's what the Prime Minister is speaking to there. But we know that the NDP managed to change some things, the Bloc managed to change some things, and it's my impression that a minority government, that's what happens. That's the nature of a functioning minority government.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at the numbers lately, but the last time I looked, they got most of the legislation through. And they got most of it through because they're in a relatively strong position. They only need, the arithmetic in Parliament is they only need one party to support them on any bill to get it through. And they've been able to pass it, different pieces of legislation with the support of different parties, in a relatively straightforward way. There's no doubt there's been a lot of dysfunction in this Parliament. That's going back several parliaments now, because Parliament is not being used in many cases the way it should be used. There's been, cutting off debate in ways that the Liberals vowed they would never do, omnibus bills in ways that they promised they would never do, filibustering committees, refusing to let committees hear witnesses, et cetera. So there's fault on all sides for whatever acrimony there exists in this Parliament. But I don't notice this as being, terribly worse than the average.
Yeah, I mean, when I think back to, the Harper government towards the end there, that was pretty awful too by the end in terms of how it functioned and the nature and tone of the discussion at the end. Maybe that just signals the end of maybe that does signal that it's time for an election.
On the big and important things, I think this has been one of the most actually successful minority governments. I mean, we are kind of forgetting that they managed to pass hundreds of billions of dollars of aid to Canadians and businesses over the past year. This wasn't legislation, but the vaccine rollout has gone far better than even some Liberals expected to see. So they've actually been able to get quite a lot through. And initially, yes, it was through all-party support. I mean, they were only able to suspend parliamentary sittings with everybody agreeing. And then the NDP, it wasn't, yes, there's been partisan games, but it was also, they introduced sick leave. There's multiple programs changed, even the wage subsidy changed because of opposition pressure. And that's the way a minority parliament is supposed to work. That is the parliament Canadians elected. And they said to those politicians, go and work together. And by and large, they did work together. Yes, it's not a huge, I'm thinking in French, bilan, or like a report card here for the Liberals, because the past year has been focused on pandemic response. So they've kind of like padded out their resume, introducing pieces of legislation, even in this last week, that have like no hope at all of passing. Hate crime legislation online, a new disability benefit. I mean, it's a little dishonest to introduce legislation knowing that it's not going to be discussed or debated, but at least they can go back to the people and say, we're still committed to these things. Please vote for us. But yeah, by and large, this has been remarkably functional.
I wonder, Chantal, if this is a function of the fact that Justin Trudeau has never had this is his first minority parliament and government, and so his expectations perhaps were different.
I've covered more than my share of minority legislatures, starting at Queen's Park in the 70s. And at the 2-year mark, the party in power usually is tired of having to listen to others and usually wants to try its luck in an election. I've also covered more than my share of those minority parliaments, more recently Stephen Harper in 2008, who ended up getting from the voters the same kind of dynamics that they were trying to get rid of. So but at this point, I think the biggest Liberal failure has been to fail to articulate a reason beyond their own political comfort to have an election sooner rather than later.
Andrew?
It's a measure of the broader dysfunction in our political culture. In most countries, it is expected as a matter of routine that parties will work together across party lines to pass legislation. It's not an extraordinary thing. It's not an emergency thing. It's not something you just do on a, when it happens, the planets align that way. It's part of the general business of governing, is you form majorities, in the legislature to get your legislation passed. It's only in Canada, or one of the few countries, where that's treated as being this terrible imposition, and the government should normally be able just to get on with governing without having to form coalitions or get support from other parties at all.
Yeah, I mean, coalition's sort of a dirty word in this country, and it took a pandemic to get any sort of incredible level of cooperation. I think that's an excellent point, Althea. Last point to you.
Yeah, there's no reason to have an election. They could keep going. I mean, Hanomansing has said that he's willing to support them for another 2 years. And Chantal is right. The Liberals have yet. I suspect that on day one, we will hear what their rationale is to have an election. But so far, there is no visible reason why the country needs to go back to the polls just 2 years from the last election.
Can I just make my traditional point here?
Yes,
that
please do.
By law, we are supposed to have fixed election dates every 4 years?
Yeah, but I would make my traditional point in that we talk about why an election is called and then no one cares by the time the election is over. That would be my...
No one cares.
Okay, hang on. Yes.
No one cares, but they often hand you back what you had going in. Or in the case of Justin Trudeau, it could be worse. He could end up winning an election, but needing 2 opposition parties to pass every single bill.
Right. Okay.
Instead of just one.
I'm glad we've all made our super smart points. Thank you. Appreciate it. Andrew, Althea, and Chantal.